which we'll see in just a moment, is from Parshat B'Shalach. Before I get to the mitzvah itself, I just want to do a general announcement. This is the end of the first set of mitzvot. We've done more than 10, actually. The reason why it's a little bit of a break is because the next mitzvah, according to the Sefer Chinuch, we're already into the 10 Commandments. So this is the only mitzvah for B'Shalach. Next time it will be Yitro, and we hit the 10 Commandments, which, by the way, the Sefer Chinuch, we'll see this more when we get there. The Sefer Chinuch says there are not 10 commandments in the 10 Commandments, but actually about 14. And we'll explain why that is. On a technical note, partly for a few different reasons. One is I'm actually leaving the country for a little bit, partly because this is a good break, and partly because Yitro will come up anyway in, I think, at the very end of January, February. We're going to take a few-week break. Torah Tibbetts will tell us when we're getting back in. We'll start back in probably, I would think, maybe the second week in January, somewhere around there, and we'll start right away with the 10 Commandments. Same style that we've been doing up until now, but just continuing on with the Sefer Chinuch. It happens to be the 10 Commandments are next. And then we'll do 14, 15 weeks together to finish the 10 Commandments, take another little break, and then we'll move on beyond that.
So the 10 Commandments in Devarim is counted the same way as the 10 Commandments here?
No, and that's part of the issue. But it's also the Sefer Chinuch, you'll see, has an easy way around this. We never actually call it the 10 Commandments, right? It's the Seret Dibrot. There are 10 statements, but contained in those statements are more than mitzvot. For example, we're going to talk a little bit about Shabbat today. The mitzvah, in the Seret Dibrot, there are actually at least 2 mitzvot that have to do with Shabbat. Meaning, when you look at the psukim that have to do with Shabbat, it actually describes a few different things. So he's able to include Dvarim, the differences, because he puts them all in here. Okay?
Who's the author of Sefer?
It's a good question. We know his first name is Aaron. We know that he's a Levi. We know that he's from Barcelona. We don't know much more than that. We know he wrote it for his son. There was a famous Aaron Halevi from Barcelona, but based upon what he writes in the Sefer Chinuch itself, and he writes in the Sefer Chinuch, he doesn't give us a date even when he wrote it, but he writes when the next Shemitah year is, and we can figure out more or less when it was written based upon that famous Aaron Halevi is not this Aaron Halevi. So we don't know exactly who he is. On purpose. He purposely writes about him not including his name because he didn't want the focus to be on him. He wanted the focus to be on the Torah. And he says, by the way, there's teachers that are much greater than me. He learns primarily his psak, how he picks the mitzvot, are primarily from the Rambam, but he also learns from the Rif, and he felt that those are really the Gedolei Hador. And he's just a little guy who kind of repackages it to make it more amenable, he felt, to a younger generation by doing it in the order of the Parshiot. Okay, so this mitzvah that we're going to deal with, we have to, before we even get to it, we have to ask a couple of questions. The mitzvah we're going to see in just a moment is Techum Shabbat. Okay, Techum Shabbat, you're not supposed to go beyond a certain distance, we'll see that in a moment, beyond inhabited, civilized areas on Shabbat. And the question we're going to ask is, why is it here? We just finished all the Pesach mitzvot. There were many, many mitzvot that had to do with Pesach. Before that, we had sort of the foundational mitzvot of Brit Milah and Pru Urvu, Kiddush HaChodesh. Pesach made a lot of sense, had to do with freedom and all these other things. As I just mentioned, we're going to get to the 10 Commandments next time we meet. What does Techum Shabbat have to do with either before or after? And if it's right here in the middle, if it's a, sort of a standalone mitzvah, what's so special, what's so important about Techum Shabbat that it deserves such, high attention here? So there's 3 ways of looking at it. One is you could say, well, Techum Shabbat has to do with Shabbat, and therefore, presumably, it's connected, it's almost like an introduction to one of the mitzvot in the 10 Commandments, Shabbat. But if you say that, why do you need an introduction for Shabbat? Why not just put this in the mitzvot of Shabbat? As we'll see, Sefer Chinuch gives us at least 2 mitzvot connected to Shabbat in the 10 Commandments. And what about an introduction to any of the other mitzvot? And why Techum Shabbat? Why is that significant? So then you could say, well, it's a mitzvah all by itself. Then you have to understand, well, what's special about it? And the other possibility, which we'll end with, is maybe Techum Shabbat actually is referring, sort of a continuation of the mitzvot that have come just before it, which are all the mitzvot to do with Pesach. So we'll look at those 3 different type of possibilities. Let's start with the Sefer Chinuch. That's on the first page at the very top. right? You see number 24, Kaf Dalet. Some of it, the English has been cut off, so I'll also read it from the original. Not to go beyond the permitted limits on the Shabbat. There is one negative precept in the Sidra. The Sidra, the Parsha, is Beshalach, which is that we are restricted from going on the Shabbat beyond the known bounds, as it is stated, let no man go out of his place on the seventh day. Right? We're familiar with this mitzvah. You're not allowed to go beyond inhabited areas. If there's always inhabited areas, so you're okay. But there's a limit of how far you can actually walk beyond a populated area. I have here, and I put it on the left-hand side in the footnotes, the actual distances that we're talking about, because he subsequently goes on and explains what are the distances that you're not supposed to walk. If you read the footnote in general, though it's not in all instances, he describes what an amma is, a cubit. It's considered to be, let's see what I have here, 18.9 inches, which is 48 centimeters, according to one view. It's 22.7 inches, according to another. Therefore, a mil, right? A mil is a unit that's used quite often in the Gemara. It's easy to remember because it sounds like mile, but it's a Roman mile, which is almost, I think there's a couple of gentlemen in the back who need to, it's almost, a Roman mile is a kilometer. And indeed, if you look down at the footnotes, a mil comes out to be, according to some people, about 960 meters, almost a kilometer. So it says, yeah.
Before we get to what is defined as an inhabited area?
It's a good question. So certainly,
I mean, in my community, if I'm going from Kew Gardens Hills to Forest Hills, I'm walking across a highway.
correct.
But it's still inhabited.
So that's a separate issue. There'll be an issue of Eruv, whether or not you can go into, an Eruv is broken up, and we'll get to see Eruv, right? Broken up by very often highways that have a certain number of people who transverse that highway on a regular basis. But this is a separate issue. Your populated area the whole time. If you're going from Kew Gardens Hills,
how populated is populated?
Well,
how do we define?
it's usually the last house, right? If you come to the last house of a city, and then you keep walking. If you've gone 2,000 amot, you're beyond. By the way, this idea is very interesting. Rav Melamed has a slightly. He's not actually commenting on this, but someone asked him a question about going to different synagogues, and he actually wrote that while walking beyond the Techum is not permitted, of course, walking on Shabbat is. And walking on Shabbat, because it's just enjoyable to walk, is great. In fact, he says that if you have, and he says it has an element of mitzvah in that there's briut in it, even on Shabbat, and therefore he says if you have a choice between two synagogues that are identical in terms of their value, it's preferable to go to the further synagogue. For no other reason that walking a little bit extra is good for you. Anyway. So that's not what the Sefer Chinuch is referring to. So here he goes on to say, you shall let no man go out of his place. Yatzah, no man should go out. The Ramban actually connects it to Eruv. He says, let no man yotzei, or yetzei. No man should carry out. And he therefore is not really talking about Techum Shabbat. This pasuk is not a source for him about Techum Shabbat, going beyond the inhabited area, but not carrying outside of an Eruv. That's a Ramban.
So we're not carrying.
We're not right. So the Sefer Chinuch would say it doesn't matter. I don't care if you're not carrying. If you're not, you should not walk this distance be outside of a city or outside of an inhabited area. Even that it could be healthy. Even there's no problem. You shouldn't go this type of distance. It doesn't come up so much in the modern times. But for example, if you're, I'll tell you where it creates a problem. If you ever go camping on Shabbat, even if you build an Eruv, you want to take a little tiyul, a little hiking. You have the problem of going too far away from the areas of the tents. Or if there's two cities that are really separate, to walk the distance between the two of them, it could be an issue, yeah.
If there's an island or a river, then are you allowed to cross the river? Or
You're saying if the river, it's still inhabited.
It's still narrower, right?
Yeah.
It's on both sides.
It's a good question. Well, you'll have other problems of crossing the river on Shabbat, and what that may entail. You're saying if there's a bridge. Yeah, no, so then it's probably, you're inside the Techum. Certainly modern cities that have bridges across the whole city. You have to go to the border of the city, not internally usually. Right? Internally is not considered beyond. It's still part of that inhabited area. Okay, so the Sefer Chinuch gives us more technical details about the distance of what exactly we're talking about. he explains your question of what exactly is the determination. This distance, right, the 2,000 cubits, is measured from the edge of the furthermost house of the city, even if it's as large as Nineveh, right? That's what the Torah says. They forbade walking more than 2,000 cubits outside of the city. So that's from the last house. What's the purpose of this mitzvah? Right? What's the significance of this mitzvah? So again, we go to the Sefer Chinuch, just a little bit below. At the root of this precept lies the aim that we should remember and know that the world was engendered out of non-existence, as it is written explicitly about the mitzvah of observing Shabbat. I apologize. Here, the continuation of the Sefer Chinuch. It's the third paragraph of the Sefer Chinuch. So it's connected to Shabbat. It's written explicitly about the mitzvah of observing the Shabbat, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and he rested on the seventh day. What word is the Sefer Chinuch focusing on? Rested. You should rest. It goes on. Therefore, in remembrance of this, that God rested, it is fitting for us that we should rest in one place, which means that we should not go out any lengthy journey, but only walk for strolling or pleasure. And in walking 12 mills, there is no great exertion. The point that he's trying to make is we emulate God through resting. It's actually a very sort of deep philosophical point, that by doing nothing, right, by not exerting, we are remembering God. In a sense, it's almost like a Kabbalistic point. The Kabbalists, in trying to explain how the world was created, run into a problem, because we believe, God fills every single centimeter, every single millimeter of the entire universe. So there's no place for God to create a world. It's already filled with God. So the Kabbalists get around this and say, so how is it possible that God created the world? So God had to, kiviyachol, tzimtzum, right? The way I think of it sometimes is if you go to a big restaurant and maybe eat a little too much, you suck in your stomach, and there's now space that your stomach once filled, right? Lahavdil, and that space is now where God can create the world. Okay, so now what happened? So we're created because God does tzimtzum. On Shabbat, God lets out his stomach, again, kiviyachol, lahavdil, everything like that, lets out the stomach, but the only way God can come back into the world then, after doing tzimtzum, in the place that God backed off, is if we do tzimtzum, right? So we have to back off, we have to rest, we have to sort of minimize ourselves, and when we minimize ourselves, so then God can actually refill that space that God made for us originally. And if anyone here is a parent, you understand that the best way of creating your child is when you back off, right? When you step back and give them a certain space, then they figure out who they really are. And therefore you've aided them in creating themselves. And then hopefully they do tzimtzum Yisrael and let you come back in. That's obviously part of the goal in what takes place in parenting. So the Sefer Chinuch says, we rest. We don't do something. And as hard as it is to imagine, because we think that resting or laziness is maybe a natural default position for human beings, it's actually a very radical position. The Romans were terribly against the whole concept of resting and not working one day a week. They felt that it was incredibly inefficient. It was a terrible waste of time. I remember once that I was interviewed. There's a guy by the name, and I may have told part of the story before, a guy by the name of Bill Maher, who has a TV show, a talk show in America. And he's a strident secularist. And he did a movie called Religulous. And the whole purpose of this movie, Religulous, was to show how ridiculous religion is. And he interviewed people from many different faiths. It was all done stereotypically, sort of privately, secretly. I got a call the night before. They said Discovery Channel wanted to interview me at the Kotel to talk about the wall and the stones that were used. And I studied everything up like that. And I get there, and Bill Maher shows up. And the guy who's doing the interviewing also is Larry Charles, who did this movie called Borat. And all these movies where they sort of hijack people without knowing. So they hijacked me at the Kotel and started challenging and trying to see how ridiculous Orthodox Judaism was. My great, I think, claim to fame, I hope was a success, is that they didn't include me in the movie. Which was my way of thinking. Maybe they thought what I said was not terrible, and therefore they didn't want to embarrass me, because everyone else in the movie is made to look like a complete fool. In them challenging me, they asked a whole series of different questions about the separation of the sexes, about how can God regret something that he did. It doesn't make any sense with regards to the creation of the world and Noach and things like that. And one of the things that really, really bothered him was Shabbat. And at the time when this movie was taking place, Joe Lieberman, if you remember, the senator from Connecticut, Orthodox senator from Connecticut, had just run for vice president and was thinking of running for president again. And that bothered him tremendously, that Joe Lieberman had said that he wasn't going to work on Shabbat as president of the United States. If there was an issue of pikuach nefesh, of need to save a life, Joe Lieberman, of course, would be involved. But if there was not an absolute dire need, he did not plan on working on Shabbat. And this was an incredibly terrifying thing for Bill Maher and others. They said, how can you not be on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? You have to be involved in this world. It can't be that someone ever shuts off their phone, or it doesn't. I tried to make the point, says, isn't that a wonderful thing for a president that has enough humility to say, the world can go on without me, right, for 24 hours? Like, we should all have that feeling. That's what Shabbat is about. The world can survive without me. And he felt that was actually a terrible thing. So this idea of resting, of pausing, is a way of emulating God, and it's more profound than perhaps we often think. So that seems to be the first reason, at least the reason the Sefer Chinuch says, and it's connected to Shabbat. Rav Hirsch adds one additional point about the importance of resting, which is in this source on the first page still. Again, I'm going to read it from the book itself because I cut off the line. I apologize. So what he has to talk about when he says Shabbat, this inactivity, this resting, not going beyond, that's the first line. He's talking about all of the malachot connected to Shabbat. And the particular point that he wants to focus on is that it's a physical activity, resting, he says, right? All of you who want to get your Shabbos snap in, you can quote this Rav Hirsch. He says that there's a physical activity involved, and he would say the same thing about eating on Shabbat and other things like that, and you'll see he mentions eating as well. And he's focusing on the purely physical as an element of spirituality. For this inactivity is no wrong, self-chosen laziness. Not doing something, you can look at a person not doing something, and it can be because they're lazy or because they're making a powerful statement. It is ordered by God and dedicated to God, and therefore as positive a value as any activity ordered by God. Right? Resting and not doing anything is as valuable as running out and doing the mitzvah of shaking a lulav and sitting in a sukkah and the like. Also, this makes eating on Shabbat itself a mitzvah, an act ordered by God, directed by God, an ennobling and happiness-bringing deed. The fact that man is to submit his efforts to gain his living to the direction of God is not to lessen or do away with the enjoyment of his earthly existence. On the contrary, is to enhance the enjoyment of his material existence and to raise the enjoyment of even sensual pleasures into the sphere of free, moral, God-serving acts, so that even by the enjoyment of his senses, his eating, his drinking, he doesn't say it here, his resting, he feels himself near to his God. That Rav Hirsch is saying you are able to makadesh almost any type of activity, and that the purpose of the physical activities is to not only make them holy, but to enjoy them. You know, they always have the expression in Yiddish, right? It's tough to be a Jew. But it's probably true, but you're not supposed to be misled to think that Judaism is not meant to be enjoyable. God tells us, Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha, right? Serve God with joy. And the Torah itself tells us, why are we being punished and all these terrible things happening to us? Because you didn't serve God with joy. It's not that you didn't serve God. It's that you didn't serve God with joy. There has to be an element of that. Rav Hirsch goes on and says that many religions have an image of sort of God being this very stern, who only wants us to sort of bow our heads and be broken when we serve God. And he says that's not the image we're supposed to have of God, that God rejoices in our joy. And in fact, it's a form of service to God to be happy. He says it's encapsulated beautifully with the mitzvah of Sudash Lishit. We're taking a meal that we don't need, right? You're full already. You don't need it. It's purely for joy. It's purely for, and it's a radical position if you think about it, because on one hand, Judaism always talks about sort of plainness and simplicity, but it's to teach us that you can even have in physical pleasures, you can turn them into holy pleasure. And I'll just give you an interesting proof text of this. What is the first mitzvah that God commands? Now, I know this is misleading because we've just done all our shirim on what is the first mitzvah, and we have the actual order in the book. But if we ignore the Sefer Chinuch, what is the first time God commands us? And what does he command us? The very first time God speaks to Adam. Prove it, right. So that's, Sefer Chinuch says, that's the first mitzvah. But God gives us a command even before Puruvu. Or I shouldn't say that. In theory, he gives the mitzvah of Puruvu before this, but the first time he speaks directly to human beings and tells them, I want you to do this, what does he say to them? Okay, that's already by the Jewish people. What does he say to Adam? Adam and Eve. He gives them a command, not a mitzvah. God gives Adam and Eve a command of how to behave on a certain issue. Not to eat from tree of knowledge of good and evil. Everyone agree with that? Right, you know that I'm misleading you.
That's not a positive thing. That's don't.
That's correct. And that's not what God says. We think that's what God says. What's the full verse? What does it say?
That you can eat from all of the trees except.
Correct. God says, eat from all the trees, except do not eat from. But you basically describe what 99% of people know to be the first time God commands us. When I've gone to large groups of students and say, what's the first thing with regard to eating God tells us? Don't eat, don't eat. No one says, no, eat. Now think about this for just a moment. You walk into a supermarket with your child, and you tell your child, you can have anything in the entire supermarket you want, this one thing you can't have. Now, of course, what does the kid remember? The one thing that you're not allowed to have. But objectively speaking, that's the most generous parent, and probably the craziest parent, that you can possibly imagine. You can eat from everything. The Meshech Chochmah says, human nature sometimes is to focus on the negative, but it's not fair to God. God commanded us, enjoy this world. Everything is here for you. Take and enjoy and have the pleasure. And if we only hear, thou shalt not, that misunderstands what God is telling us, and it's insulting to sort of God and the relationship that God wants to have with us. There's a beautiful Gemara in the Yerushalmi in Kiddushin that there was a rabbi who was concerned about this idea, that he used to plant every year as many different types of fruit trees as possible. And the reason why he planted all these different types of fruit trees, he says, I'm concerned that if I go a year and don't eat a fruit that God says is permissible to eat, and I don't eat it, that somehow is insulting to God. And you can understand that. If someone gives you a present and you never use it, or I have a relative, every time you give them a present, they take the present, and it's like an article of clothing, and they put it in their closet unwrapped. And you can go in that closet and it's filled with all the unwrapped. So that's not an overly inspiring type of thing to take place. God gives us a present and we don't enjoy it. We don't say, "How, this is wonderful, this is great." So that's a big problem. So that's, I think, the continuation of what Rav Hirsch is trying to teach us, is that you can enjoy, and you should enjoy, and it's a mitzvah to enjoy, even physical things such as rest or eating food and the like. Okay. There is, I think, another way. Oh, let me add one more thing about this concept of joy, and then I want to share with you another way of perhaps explaining this mitzvah. We'll see this later when the Moshe comes down from the Mount Sinai, and he hears that the Jews are sinning with the golden calf. It's a very odd sequence of events. God tells Moshe at the top of Har Sinai, the Jews are sinning, right? They've sinned with the chet of the golden calf. I want to make you a new nation. And Moshe says, I won't hear any of it. I don't accept. I'm going to run down and we're going to see what happens. The Oral Torah says what's in Moshe's mind is that the Jewish people could do tshuva. Okay? God says if they're sinning, fine, I believe that they're sinning, but they could still do tshuva. Moshe runs down, and it says that he gets to the outskirts of where they are, and Yoshua hears the noise, the singing, and the dancing all around the golden calf. And at that point in time, Moshe loses hope, and he throws the tablets and smashes them. And the Old Torah says there, at this point in time, Moshe realizes that they're not going to do tshuva. So the question is, when God tells Moshe what's happening, Moshe rejects it. When he gets it and he sees it with his own eyes, or from Yeshua, he accepts it. So how do we explain that? So one answer is, well, when you see something with your own eyes, it's different than hearing it. Although God is a pretty reliable source, you maybe should believe more from God even than what you see with your own eyes. And so the Old Torah says it's not that. He says the difference is God left out one detail. When God tells them, Moshe, that they're sinning, it just says that they're sinning with the golden calf. When he sees it, he describes it as they're singing and dancing with this sin. And the Old Torah says as follows. He says, when people sin because it's out of temptation, or it's because of laziness, or they didn't know, he says, a person can always do tshuva. He says, when a person sins, and they enjoy it, they're doing it with simcha, so then you can't break them from that sin, because when you do something for simcha, right, it's a very powerful motivation. And therefore, when he sees that they're enjoying their sin, Moshe gives up hope. This, by the way, I remember during the Intifada, people would come and visit Israel. And the people who came to visit Israel, there are always two groups of people who like to come to Israel. One is they feel like they should visit Israel. They feel guilty. They have to support the state of Israel. They're trying to get their kids to feel guilty that we have to make sure this nation lives, continues. And those who just, when they come to Israel, they love it. They just feel totally renewed and rejuvenated and the like. And I noticed that during the Intifada, the people who came to Israel, even though this is a time when you think you should come out of guilt, right? No one's coming, so I should come because I care about the state. Those people didn't come at all. The people who came to Israel during the time when no one wanted to be in Israel were the people who loved coming to Israel. Because simcha is actually a more powerful motivation than guilt or fear or anything like that. Yes?
You had a chance, I heard a story about Judge Louis Brandeis, who went to visit his uncle, who was an Orthodox Jew, I think in Georgia or one of the southern states. And came there Friday, and they had a beautiful Shabbos meal, and everything was peaceful. No telephone, no radio. I don't know if they had television those days.
Right.
Nothing.
Certainly no smartphone.
No interruptions.
Right.
They discussed the Parsha Shavua, and everything was delicious, and it was lit up with the candles, the table, and everything like that. So afterwards, he writes to his uncle. He says, I really had a wonderful, wonderful time here. There was one problem that I take issue with. Too many restrictions. He didn't get the whole purpose.
The thing was a positive, right?
This restriction.
Yeah.
That was what made it so special. Was the
restrictions are what free, right? I always tell people when I explain to them about Shabbat, I say, all of a sudden when you can't run to a meeting and you can't answer the phone and you can't run to some outside event, all of a sudden you're with your family. And you always have an excuse why you can't be with your family, and they're important and they're pressing issues. Now you're there. It's exactly right. The restrictions what open it up.
We always say it's not that you can, it's that you don't have to.
You don't have to. Okay, let's think of another way of thinking about this mitzvah. Because up until now, the mitzvah seems clearly connected to Shabbat. What's the other possibility what else could it be connected to? So I want to actually share with you, I think we have the time, yeah. So I came across this interesting Gemara that at first I thought it was almost like Purim Torah. So the Gemara in Shabbat talks about Moshe Rabbeinu and the giving of Shabbat. And when Shabbat is given, Moshe says it had to be given to human beings and not to the angels, because the angels can't rest on Shabbat. Okay, so we see that resting is a big part of Shabbat. You have to be able to rest on Shabbat. The angels can't rest on Shabbat. But then someone challenges that and argues and says, wait a second. The Techum of Shabbat, right, which we were talking about, which we said is 2,000 cubits beyond the inhabited area, also has an issue of height, right? You also can't go too high above the ground. Now, that's not relevant for most of us, but for angels who can fly, right, that's relevant for them. So they actually do have to rest because they're not allowed to go up too high, and therefore they have to stay down on the ground. So the response to that is, because we still want to defend Moshe and say that the Shabbat can only be given to human beings, the response to that is that the Techum Shabbat is not a malacha. Meaning, Shabbat was given to Moshe, but Techum Shabbat is kept outside of the gift of Shabbat. that it's not actually, it's related to Shabbat, it's connected to Shabbat, but it's not really part of Shabbat. You learn this from the angels. By the way, you don't have to learn it just from the angels. The Minchas Chinuch says the same. There's a beautiful midrash about when Ruth decides to convert. Nomi says, okay, I'm going to teach you about Judaism, but I only have enough time to teach you about one mitzvah. And the one mitzvah I'm going to teach you about is Techum Shabbat, the mitzvah we just have been learning. So if you're going to talk about Shabbat, so there's a lot of things you could talk about Shabbat. Why specifically Techum Shabbat? And why Techum Shabbat as opposed to many of the other mitzvahs? So there must be something deeper besides, as deep as Shabbat is, that's even outside of the world Shabbat. And as I say, when I first heard this, it almost struck me as Purim Torah, and I just want to share with you one thing. It's not going to push us much further in our understanding, but it's only a minute and 30 seconds, so maybe it'll be cute nevertheless. I just came across it when I was, came across it about 10 years ago. But this is a guy, and he reminded me a little bit of the 10 Amot, that you're because in this midrash that says the angels can't fly, they can't go up too high, they can't go above. There's also Techum Shabbat of going up 10 Amot. So this is a guy who's trying to explain how we know that Moshe Rabbeinu is a Satmar Rebbe. I don't know if you knew that, but Moshe Rabbeinu is a Satmar, in case you're wondering. I know you won't be able to all see it, but you'll be able to hear it. I don't know if you'll understand his accent, but you'll get a sense. Anyway, don't take...
Moshe's of the Satmar Rebbe.
What?
Moshe's of the Satmar Rebbe's accent.
No.
Which accent don't we understand?
Oh, no, you'll see. This guy who's explaining. Apparently they're driving up somewhere in upstate New York, and he's giving a little Torah as they speak. Anyway, hopefully you'll be able to hear it, even if not see all the things. Oh, am I connected?
And Chanukah can be, was that 20 of them?
Right, so there's... And there, oh, there we go.
First of all, was Moshe Rabbeinu a chassid or a misnagid? And if he was, then what was it? If he was, we have to categorize within the category. So, first of all, who's Vishuvan that he should be a misnagid? Clearly, Moshe Rabbeinu could not have been a misnagid. There's just no way, it's not even what he's talking about, he's not a misnagid, he's a chassid. Mamish, there's no question about it, he just was. End of discussion. Fine, now. If we've established that he's a chassid, then what was it? I am put forward that it says it's an open base in Chumash, that he's a Satmar, and I will tell you how. It says, Moshe Rabbeinu was 10 Amos tall. It says that the Mishkan was 10 Amos tall. Now, if Moshe Rabbeinu was a chassid, he wore a hat. And if he was as tall as the Mishkan, the hat had to be flat, and not any higher than the top of his head. Now, who wears the hats that are taller than the top of the head? Satmars and a little bit of Breslev. Now, it is the main middle of Satmar to wear the flat Bajik Bebas. It is a minor Breslev minhag, it's not so common. Now, if Moshe Rabbeinu was a Breslev and he wore the flat hat, and that would have been the main Breslev minhag, and all Breslev with the flat hats, and so we wouldn't have the diversity that we see today. Now, from this Viloi, Moshe Rabbeinu must have been a Satmar because it is a main Satmar minhag. And besides, how could anybody go without a Bajik Bibber? So, from this Viloi, that Moshe Rabbeinu was a Satmar.
Right, it's very convincing, right? Okay, you understand his logic. It's not so important to understand for our understanding, but it had to be the flat hat. Anyway, when I heard that midrash and I heard this, it sounded like Purim Torah. The angel can't go up too high. He has to actually prove that he rested. But then it really began to sit with me. Maybe this mitzvah is not connected to Shabbat. It's connected to something totally different. And when you read in the Sefer Chinuch, you won't see it, because the Sefer Chinuch just gives you the pasuk. Right? What does it he say? Lo yatsa. Don't go beyond the Techum on Shabbat. But what's the context? Does anyone know the context in Bishalach if you read the other verses before? So I just brought quickly on the second page from the Chumash. And what this whole paragraph goes on and says, I won't necessarily read it all because you're probably familiar with the story. But Vayidber Hashem el Moshe, I have to actually read it inside because again, I cut off the line. He says, I've heard all of your complaints. Let's start here. I've heard all of your complaints. And so God is now going to give you food. I apologize because I'm not reading inside there. Let's see if I'm here. If anyone wants it, this is chapter 16. I'm trying to think where it's in here. Okay, this is, I'm reading ahead. I'm reading first in the Chumash before we get to this source. They've just encamped. Ve'yalinu kol adat b'nei Yisrael, the entire congregation of Israel, they began to complain against Moshe. Vayomru elehem b'nei Yisrael, and the children of Israel said unto them, we wish we had died in the land of Egypt, where we had flesh pots, and when we ate bread to the full, and you took us out of this wilderness to kill us. God says to Moshe, I'm now going to make for you a bread from the heavens, the manna, the man, and you'll gather it, and I may test them whether they will walk in my teaching or not. Manna is a test, is a challenge. If they'll come to pass on the sixth day, when they prepare that which they bring home, it shall be twice as much as they gather daily, right? Every single day, you go out and you get what you need for that day. The text goes on. Not more, not less. Only what you personally, ochlo, he personally is able to eat. If you take too much, what happens? There'll be worms and maggots that will destroy it. On Friday, however, you have a concern. On Friday, you can't go out on Shabbat to go get it, so you get your double portion, right? Do you believe God that will always provide for you every day, everything along the way? But on Friday, you get the double portion, and it will stay fresh for the next day. It's in that context that the pasuk says, "V'lo yatsa." Not that you are not supposed to go out on Shabbat. You're not supposed to go out on Shabbat to collect the man. So the Sefer Chinuch is a little bit misleading, right? It suggests that it's all about Shabbat, but really, if you read the whole context, it's really all about the man. That's what this mitzvah seems to me to be primarily about. And then there's all the lessons that could be included in this idea. And there's a whole series of different lessons. One of the biggest ones, of course, is, do you have faith in God, right? Is God going to provide for you? Because you can't, everyone always wants to be like a squirrel and collect all the acorns and make sure that you have it for a rainy day. But at the end of the day, you have to have faith that God is going to provide for you tomorrow, even without having it today. There's a Hasidic Rebbe who always used to say that one should have absolute total faith in God, except he should be an apikorsis in one issue, and that's tzedakah, in charity. A person comes to you and says, I really need help. You should not believe in God at that moment. Because if you believe in God at that moment, what do you say to that person? God will provide, right? For that one moment, it's tzedakah, you should not believe in God. You should be an apikorsis. All other instances, you should have absolute total faith in God. Of course, what do most people do? So they're an apikorsis in the other way. They never believe that they have enough. Right? They always believe that they need more, right? They don't believe in God at that point in time that God will provide, that they have enough. But when it comes to the person who comes for tzedakah, they say, oh, I believe in God. Don't worry, you'll be fine. God will take care of you, and you have nothing to worry about. There's a beautiful Gemara, Mishnah, that I think teaches this. I was just learning it the other day, not necessarily connected to this, and we'll see it as an independent mitzvah, a standalone mitzvah all by itself, the mitzvah of bar matzah, which is, you own a field, and there's, let's say, a person who has owns the field next to you, and let's say this then person passes away, and now the children have it, and they're able to sell as an inheritance. So they could sell to a third party altogether, or if the person who owns the field right next to him would like it, they should really sell it to him. Same price. We're not talking about a difference in price. Why should they sell it to him? Because for that one person who has a field already right next to it, it's more valuable to him than it is to an individual. And the Mishnah in Bava Batra says, and if you, now the sons who have inherited that, decide not to sell it to him, but sell it to a different person, that's midat stom. You have engaged in the quality of those who lived in stom v'amorah. And the question is why? And the Gemara goes on and says, because it didn't cost you anything. It didn't make a difference to you one little bit if you sold to him or to him, and yet it makes a huge difference to another person. Why not be kind? Why not help the other person, even if it doesn't cost you anything? So I think the modern Western mentality, response would say, well, that's not true. because I could squeeze him a little bit more, even though, let's say the value is X. I could probably get from him, because it is worth more to him, I could probably get from him X plus 1, X plus 2. The Jewish mentality, however, according to the Gemara, and I would say here as well, is if it doesn't really, meaning, what do we view as cost? So one mentality says, well, since I can get more, that's a cost. The idea of the man is, I should be satisfied with what I have. I've just gotten, I'm getting a fair price, that's enough, and if I can do another favor for a person, I don't have to squeeze more out of that favor as well. But anyway, so the concept is that we should be satisfied and have faith in God, that everything will be provided for us. There are other lessons, of course, that exist as well. The man, there's different opinions of what the man was. If you see actually on the second page, I actually brought down, we had spoken about miracles before. What might the man be? And this is a collection from a scientific book of explaining what the man might have been from purely rational grounds. Some say it was sort of a honey that came out of a flower that hardened. And every morning it would come out like that. But then they say, no, it couldn't have been the man because that would be too sweet and too sugary, but it wouldn't have enough protein to live off of. But usually, by the way, the Psukim speak about eating the man together with also the slav. Exactly, thank you. What is that in English?
Some kind of bird.
Dove, yeah, right. Okay, yeah,
Quail.
Quail, thank you. So others say no, it was a type of excrement that came from locusts, and so that was what the man was. Anyway, they explain that there's rational explanations of what this man might have been, but the midrashic understanding is the man was always the same for everyone. It looked the exact same, but if you could imagine, it could taste like whatever you want it to taste like. People always compare it to tofu, right? Tofu today, it looks the exact same, but it's just a vehicle for you to put any flavor you want on that tofu, and it can taste. So there's a couple of, I think, lessons here that you could possibly learn. In California, there was a riot in a prison a number of years ago because someone, an accountant, I don't want to make fun of accountants, someone who actually was thinking pretty smart, came up with the perfect food. A food that had the perfect amount of protein, the perfect amount of nutrients, everything you needed, and it tasted good. And they put it into a patty. It tasted good. And they gave it to the prisoners, and the prisoners loved it. It was delicious. And they said, we don't have to now change the menu on a daily basis. This has everything you possibly need. And they gave the exact same menu for something like 35 days, straight through. And as I said, the prisoners liked the food. They thought it was good and everything like that. And they had a riot. Why? Because it was the exact same food. And eventually, the sameness is what threw them off. They couldn't stand it. And it's a test, right? It's a test. Experiencing the exact same thing, the mundane daily life that's identical to the day before, is a challenge and a test to be able to derive meaning from that in and of itself. There's a beautiful midrash with regards to Noah and the flood and the rainbow. Now, we always assume that the rainbow was a new creation of God, right? That all of a sudden there was never a rainbow before. The rainbow comes in to teach us that God will never again destroy the world. But the Midrash says it's not true. The rainbow existed for all time, right? It's a scientific reality. When you have rain and the sun and the prism, you get a rainbow. So what was it then that happened or took place with Noah? Noah saw the exact same thing that he'd seen many, many times before, a rainbow, but he now invested it with a different meaning. That's the real miracle, is that a person can see or experience the exact same thing they've seen or experienced 1,000 times before and still invest within it a totally new and exciting meaning. So that was one of the challenges that we are challenged with regards to Laman, to invest it with different meaning. There's a spiritual element to that as well. The idea is, there's a couple of midrashim, and I put them on the first page off to the side. These midrashim speak about how the Torah couldn't have been accepted until we understood what man was really all about. They went to go collect all of their things. Elu mechosrei emunah shebi Yisrael. Those who went out on the seventh day to look for the man, they were called those who lacked faith. Right? They didn't believe that God was going to provide for them. Yet the next midrash to the left. Yatsu min ha'am, they went out to go collect. Zed datan v'aviram. They went out to collect. We know what Datan and Aviram eventually go out and try to rebel against Moshe. That's exactly how lacking of faith they had. The next midrash below. Yatsu min ha'am vayavo Amalek. That when people went out because they didn't have faith in God, that's when Amalek attacks them. And God is actually frustrated with that idea. He says, the next line below, it says, the next midrash below, Hotseiti etchem miMitzrayim, I took you out of Egypt, I split the sea, I give you this, I do all these miracles for you, and yet you still don't have faith in me. Amalek then comes and attack. What does Amalek represent? Amalek represents the belief that things just happen coincidentally. Right? There's a lot, when we get to the Mitzvah of Amalek, we'll talk more about it, but that, in a nutshell, is one of the ideas, that things happen coincidentally, without intention. And the idea of the man is to say, no, God is watching us every step of the way. God is helping us along the path. And so therefore, there's a statement of learning to have faith in God, that God provides, and the other things that we mentioned already. One other idea with man is that because it could become whatever you dreamt it would become, some commentaries have said this is a mashal to inspire us. Just as this food can become whatever you want it to become if you can dream it. Similarly, if you want to almost get close to Herzl's line, if you will it, it is no dream. If you learn that skill of envisioning something in the future and then it becoming that, you'll then be inspired to do it in your own life. If you can envision something, then you'll work towards that and be able to accomplish it as well. Those are some of the lessons of Man, and that might be the reason why this mitzvah, as I said, there's three possibilities. One is that it's supposed to introduce us to Shabbat that's coming. The other is that it's independent all by itself. And the third possibility, which I just want to spend a couple moments on, right? We have about 7 minutes. The third possibility is what? That this mitzvah of Techum Shabbat is somehow connected to Pesach. How is this connected to Pesach? Anyone want to give it a shot? It's not obvious. But I'll argue once we see it, it's actually very obvious.
It doesn't have to do with going from house to house, does it?
Well, you may be close. In which sense?
Because you're supposed to be in your house.
Yeah.
In other words, and you're not supposed to be mingling with others. You're supposed to.
What does that sound
in
like to
your
you?
place.
What does it sound like to you? No, Techum Shabbat, and what else does it sound? How does it sound like? What is it related to in Pesach?
Well, I thought that's what it's related to. In other words, the Korban Pesach.
Exactly, right? It's not going out, stay in your home, right? What I'd like to argue, and I've seen it in a few different people, there's a Rabbi, Yonatan Grossman, I think, who gives the most sources that I've seen, that it's actually very connected in terms of linguistic usage in this parsha of the Torah and the Korban Pesach. There's a great number of connections. I'll just mention a few with you. I read already a little bit from the text, and I said that Man was related to Kol Adat Yisrael. Remember, it says, in the entire community, it's introduced, the entire community began to complain against Moshe. The word Adat, community, is not used quite often in the Torah, and in here, with regards to Man, it's used frequently. Kol Adat, Kol Adat, Kol Adat, and the only other place where it's used that same frequency is with regards to the Korban Pesach. Kol Hadat is done that. Man is also introduced with the date. We actually know the date. It's interesting. The Torah does not give us much dates while the Jews are in the desert. In fact, it doesn't give us the specific date on any activity, right? Even Shavuot, right? We know the date, but we know it only because it's a relationship to Pesach. But there's no specific date with regards to any of the activities in the desert, except for when the Man begins. It tells us on the 15th of the month of the second month. That also, when did Pesach? The 15th of the month. There's language here that speaks about Ben Arba'im, Ben Hashmashot. Right, that's when the Korban Pesach began the process of doing the Korban. Ben Hashmashot, Ben Arba'im. Here with the Man, it's the opposite. It's dawn time, but the same language is used between night and day. It's the same language at twilight time. Let me just see if there's any other things.
What's the point?
So I'm going to get to that. Let me just show you a few other sources. God commands us, collect as much of the man as you are required to eat, an omer for each person. For as many as you are in each, you shall fetch for those in the tent. right? The Karban Pesach, it's for all of your family that's needed, only that which is needed, not more. The same thing here. You're not allowed to leave the Karban Pesach over, right? We said if you leave it over, you have to burn it. What happens with the man? You're not allowed to leave it over, otherwise it gets ruined for the worms and the maggots. There's a number of different sources here. So exactly the question you asked. So let's say the man is somehow a continuation of Karban Pesach. What are we supposed to learn from that? So what I'd like to suggest is the Karban Pesach clearly has a tremendous amount of lessons to teach us. We've spent probably about 3 or 4 weeks on how it had to be slaughtered, how it had to be roasted, how it had to be eaten together. There were lessons of unity, right? There was lessons of seeing God everywhere. There's the concept of miracles, remember, all these different ideas. There's one problem, though, using the experience of Karban Pesach as a model for personal growth, religious growth, or communal growth. And the problem is that it's a once-in-a-lifetime event, right? The truth is, we re-experience it every single year. But even that, every single year, one time, is not enough to change a personality. It's not enough to... It's an amazing, powerful event. But think about some of your own Seders. There was something at the Seder that was incredibly inspirational. A week later, did you remember what it was? Or 2 months later, do you remember what it was? That the problem of human nature is we can have certain aspirations, and I always think one of the greatest differences between Judaism and other religions is halacha. And one of the reasons why I think it's such a great difference is halacha is always with you, right? You leave the bathroom, you have to think about God making a bracha. Every time you sit down to eat, you make a bracha, you're thinking about God. Everything you're doing, there's always something going on. Everywhere you go, right? Yeah. Halakha, your walk. In some other religions, and I've experienced it because I've had people from some of these other religions come and sit at our house for Shabbat dinner, and they actually complain to me. They say, we need some of these things. Because they say they go to church religiously. Every single week on Sunday, they're there. And they're inspired, and they listen, and it's wonderful, but they forget about the sermon on Sunday. On Monday. On Tuesday, right? I was thinking Shabbat, right? They forget about... In my congregation, they forget about what I say on Sunday. They forget about the next day. It's hard to keep it alive unless you have constant reminders, right? That's what we have all the time. We have reminders, meaning I would suggest that probably a quarter of our mitzvot are reminder mitzvot. The mitzvah is to remind us of something else that's valuable. If you have tzitzit, look at the tzitzit and remember this, right? Remember this. Remember, even when we say Shema, remember Egypt. Right, you have to have constant reminders of these great, powerful ideas. And I think that whole concept is taught through the man. There's these wonderful ideas of Karban Pesach, of the Yetziat Mitzrayim, but you can't wait until next Pesach to infuse those values into your life. So God says, the man, something as simple as eating. Every single day, you have to eat. Right? Every single day you're going to have an experience, and in that you're going to remember God. You're going to remember the exact same values that we had with Karban Pesach, plus more, all the other values of man. But everything that happened in Karban Pesach, you're going to introduce it into your life on a constant basis. And I think that's the underlying point of Techum Shabbat, if we can think about it. As important as Shabbat is and connected to Shabbat, it's really to remind us about the concept of the man, and the real lesson of the man is continuity and consistency. That it's not enough just to hold an idea in your head. You have to somehow get it into your feet. I remember Rabbi Riskin once used to say that he felt Jews who were not observant sometimes had heart problems because they say, I feel Judaism in my heart, right? And so he says, that's not fair to your heart. Put all your Judaism in your heart and your feelings. What about walking to shul? What about putting on tefillin? What about giving tzedakah? What about lighting candles? Meaning, use your whole body, and you'll remember it much more powerfully than just feeling something in your heart, something in your head. He said it's not enough. Just want to end with this last point. That is something that we'll see in many mitzvot, and that is this importance of consistency and continuity. There is a machloket, and I may have mentioned this one time before, in the very beginning of the Ein Yaakov, but it's worthwhile to repeat. The Ein Yaakov, which is a collection of the Agadata in the Talmud, and there's an opening machloket about what is the most important mitzvah in the Torah. Many say v'ahavta l'recha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself. Others say, v'hafta Hashem Elokecha, love the Lord your God with all your might, all your soul. And Ben Pazi says the sacrifice, the daily sacrifice. You remember that you bring the tamidi, the one that you bring all the time, 2 sheep that you always bring every day for a karbanah. And why is that important? That, by the way, is the halacha. They say halacha Ben Pazi. The halacha is just like the person who says that's the most important pasuk in the entire Torah. Why is that so important? Because the hafta l'recha kamocha and the hafta Hashem Elokecha and all the wonderful, lofty, empowering ideas in the Torah only really are meaningful if you can do it every single day. If you can really make it a part of your daily life. If it's only up here in the realm of ideas, so then it's not as valuable as if you can bring it and implement it on a regular basis. Have a good week. Have a good couple weeks until we meet again. As I say, read the Torah tidbits to see when we start again sometime around middle of January with the 10 Commandments.